West Coast groundfish is such a beacon of hope in the world of seafood. It is probably the best ecological comeback story that we have.
20 years ago, groundfish was at the brink of disaster.
And through a lot of hard work and compromise in the last 5 years, almost all the stocks have recovered.
We need to get the public, make them aware of what top quality products we have. So once they get a taste of that, I know they never go back to tilapia again, but I'm just saying,
Whatever you want to do, if you want to make a fish soup or pasta or just a nice piece of fish to grill, it's coming from all the incredible groundfish species that we have here.
Please welcome back to the stage the Vice President for External Affairs, National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, Shannon Colbert.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Capitol Ocean Week. So our first plenary for this afternoon is titled Adaptive Fisheries Management in the Face of Climate Change. Warming waters, ocean acidification, rising sea levels caused by climate change are shifting the abundance and the distribution of fish stocks, disrupting seafood supply chains, and leading to significant economic losses and food insecurity. Fisheries management is adapting through the implementation of frameworks like ecosystem-based management, supporting strong fisheries science and stock assessments, and exploring adaptive permitting structures in order to strive for more climate-ready fisheries. I want to thank our session co-sponsors, the Walton Family Foundation and Builders Initiative, for supporting this conversation and this discussion. I'd like to invite our panel out and take the stage and introduce our moderator, Jay Odell. Jay is a Fisheries and Ocean Conservation Fellow at the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth University. His current research examines climate change impacts on ocean ecosystems, marine life, as well as dependent fisheries communities to inform inclusive collaborations to identify and drive adaptive actions that are needed to sustain fisheries and ocean health. We could not ask for a better moderator to help lead us through this session, as well as a fantastic panel. So, Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that nice, warm introduction. Well, I think I don't need to make the case that was made so well this morning about how much of what we care about, the climate, the global economy, is really a wholly owned subsidiary of the ocean. What the ocean is this planet's biggest life support system. And there's nothing that's more important than saving that. And climate change is habitat change. All over the ocean planet, critters are moving towards the poles, more or less. They go in the wrong direction some too, but that is clearly the trend. And along with that, those range shifts, range expansions, and range contractions of a lot of the harvest species that comprise our fisheries, we really have a lot of changes on the productivity of stocks. The altered temperatures, the warming ocean and its knock-on effects are really altering survival growth rates and survival rates. And these changes aren't subtle. Here in the mid-Atlantic, this migratory crossroads of the ocean that we call the mid-Atlantic region, these ongoing range shifts for species like summer flounder, range expansions for species like black sea bass, they're causing, as Bob knows all too well, really, and Janet, and everybody in this room probably, really bitter allocation conflicts and lawsuits, while the distributions of today's fish are often based on the allocations that were made many, many years ago. There's a lot of adjustment that's happening right now. Sadly, there's a lot of sad news. The southern New England lobster fishery is long gone, and the Gulf of Maine fishery, pink shrimp fishery, closed in 2013, and it's just too warm for them. On the West Coast, the big mass of water that's not affectionately called the blob is really wreaking havoc, driving mortality rates for marine wildlife, birds and marine mammals on these episodic events, and for species that are extremely important mainstays of West Coast fisheries like the Dungeness crab. In a few minutes, we're going to hear firsthand about the devastating impacts of climate on and other factors on Alaska crab fisheries. And along with all this grim news, there are climate winners, and we have to acknowledge those too. We have, for example, a brand new white shrimp fishery in Virginia. Those big, delicious white shrimp have moved up around the bend from Cape Hatteras, and I think the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, is doing a good job of sort of saying, here we have an opportunity to develop a sustainable fishery from the ground up, and they're going slow. But we can expect a lot of additional new species moving into different places around the U.S. and around the planet. And these are maybe little silver linings that help soften the blow when a fisherman's 401k essentially swims away. But on balance, the news is not great at the moment. So how do we get to climate ready or climate resilient fisheries? I struggle with those R words. I'm not sure we'll ever be ready, but we could be as ready as possible. And we can certainly take some actions that minimize the negative impacts and create some new sustainable opportunities in the fisheries space. Fisheries science is a bit broken right now, and I think we might get into that a little bit more in our discussion. But as we start to reinvent how we do stock assessments and how we can leverage some new technology to really speed up fisheries management, to be more nimble, we absolutely have to remember that the path to climate resilient fisheries absolutely has to go through basic fisheries management. It's hard to know, it's hard to achieve sustainable fisheries when you're not sure how many fish you're catching, for example. So we're going to address some of these long-standing challenges, including, modernizing our fisheries data systems, and there's a lot of great progress in that space. Amazing, and it's encouraging. I also want to mention, that recent research has shown that increasingly our officially designated fisheries disasters are the result of climate, and that whole program needs to be reinvented. I think if Representative Peltola had been able to be here today, we probably would have heard some about that. The men and women who go to sea in boats to bring our food to shore have solutions. The ocean is their office. And we're not going to achieve climate resilient fisheries without the knowledge, the skills, and the energy that they bring. We need to also, as has been mentioned so beautifully and strongly lately, we need to do a much better job at integrating indigenous people's knowledge, their values, their authorities, their rights in many fisheries. One thing, the news can get kind of grim and overwhelming, and what has given me some hope recently is that about 2 years ago, 5 shops of NOAA, headquarters, and the management and science shops from the Southeast and the Northeast region, and the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission all really rolled up their sleeves and dug in. There's a fabulous core team that just worked really hard on this, and I don't think that they were able to put other work aside when they did it. I don't know how they did it. But they ran a really great process. The scenario planning process for developing evidence-based, plausible future scenarios that then provides a structure for thinking about what the right adaptive actions might be. A lot of folks were engaged, about 300 stakeholders from Maine to Florida. And a list of solutions is emerging, and it's pretty exciting. Everything is well documented on the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council's website. They've done a really fabulous job. So now we are at the stage where this menu of solutions is emerging, and to nobody's great surprise, I suppose, there's some really tough issues about interjurisdictional authorities. As the fish are moving, it might mean that our jobs are going to have to change as well. And people are getting a little bit grumpy, and it's hard. It's natural for the inertia of the status quo to set in when it's time to move from planning to action. We don't have time. We don't have time for turfy process battles. We don't have time to study things to perfection. Either we get a lot more busy now, or we can expect really staggering losses. As Dr. Levchenko said this morning, we don't have time for incremental change. As Queen Quet said, when is the time we need to get busy? Oh yeah. It's going to take all hands on deck to sustain the world's largest life support system in the face of climate change. NOAA, the regional councils, the commissions, and many diverse communities. Today's panel represents, in a way, all of those elements, and I'm really excited to hear what they think. And so without any further ado, I'm going to invite each panelist to introduce themselves, and we'll get started, starting with our fabulous Assistant Administrator for Fisheries, Janet Coit.
Thank you. Thanks, Jay. Thank you, Jay, and good afternoon, everyone. I am thrilled to be here with these talented co-panelists and all of you. We're all colleagues. So just a few comments about myself. I'm the Assistant Administrator for NOAA Fisheries, which people sometimes refer to as the National Marine Fisheries Service. And I'll get back to that. But I wanted to just start by saying I'm a mom and I'm an extrovert, and having this job means that I get to meet and interact with a ton of interesting people from all walks of life. The three experiences that led me here were working in the US Senate for quite a number of years, and I worked there in a time in the late 80s and early 90s when there was a lot of bipartisan, successful reauthorizations of our major statutes. I met Jay when I worked at the Nature Conservancy for 10 years, and primarily leading the Rhode Island chapter, but also working to create a marine conservation program. And then I've spent the last 10 years before this job as the head of a state agency, the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, where I worked for 3 governors. Lastly, Governor Gina Raimondo, who's now the Secretary of Commerce, and she's a fantastic leader, and I was so pleased to come and work with her at the Department of Commerce and work for the Biden-Harris administration. So now I have this awesome, incredibly hard job managing fisheries and living marine resources, looking out for and recovering protected species and marine mammals, working from 300 to 200 miles around the nation and our territories. And it's just a place where my love of conservation and nature and my interest in problem solving and policy come together every day. And these issues that we're talking about in terms of how the systems that used to seemingly work well to sustainably manage fisheries are now disjointed with the ecosystem changes that we're experiencing is something that's really consuming focus for me, for all of NOAA, and across the administration. So I'll stop there and hand it off to Jamie next to introduce herself, but great to be here this afternoon.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here. It's great to see so many people interested in this topic. I'm Jamie Goen, Executive Director for Alaska Bering Sea Crabbers. We represent harvesters of king, snow, and bear-eye crab that fish in the Bering Sea with pot gear. I've been with the crabbers for 5 years. A little bit about me and my background and the lens that I bring to this position. I actually worked for NOAA Fisheries for 15 years. I worked on the East Coast and the West Coast, and a little bit in NOAA headquarters on catch share programs around the country. And before that, I worked in oceanography, actually, starting to collect data and mapping the world's oceans on carbonate chemistry. So this topic of fisheries and climate change is very near and dear to my heart. For Alaska crab fishermen that I work with, we are dealing with a climate-induced fishery collapse right now. We're in it. Our snow crab fishery was closed for the first time in US history, and our red king crab fishery is closed for the second year in a row. For snow crab, there was no planning for it. In fact, our top-notch climate scientists, which by the way are doing incredible cutting-edge science in Alaska, commented that they would not have been able to predict the magnitude of the snow crab collapse that we're facing right now. I hope other fisheries in the US don't have to go through what the crab industry is going through. We'd like to use our crab fisheries as a test case to take positive steps forward and build resilient fisheries and take actions now. Fish provides a healthy protein to feed people with less carbon footprint than many other proteins. And US fisheries are applauded for being sustainably managed. But we're starting to see increasing challenges and are going to need to adapt and evolve to keep our fisheries sustainable and our fishing communities vibrant. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Great. Great, thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for coming today. Really appreciate it. I'm super excited to be here and I'm a member of this panel. My name is Bob Beal. I'm the Executive Director for the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. For those of you that are not super familiar with ASMFC, we are the states from Maine through Florida, so from the U.S.-Canadian border all the way down to the Florida Keys. And I think that's one of the reasons I was asked to participate in this meeting is that, you know, if you think of the environment and the ecosystems all the way from cold water, deep water fisheries in the Gulf of Maine down through the tropical warm waters of Florida, there's a whole lot going on. And as Jay said, we're in the mid-Atlantic here. This is a mixing zone. And if you look at kind of a heat map of climate change for around the world, where sea surface temperatures have changed the most in the last 30 to 40 years, there's a big red blob from Cape Hatteras up through the Gulf of Maine, and it's pretty yellow down in the South Atlantic as well. So, you know, at ASMFC, we're collectively managing with the states 27 species of fish and shellfish, and those fish, many of them are doing things completely different than what they did when I started the commission 25 years ago. And when I've been the executive director for a decade, and things are very different than when I started as executive director as well. So, you know, climate change is absolutely a driving force on the East Coast for essentially every management decision that we make at ASMFC. And, you know, it's as everyone's touched on these topics of productivity, distribution, ecosystem interactions, food web changes, and you know, and it's not just fin fish and shellfish. It's marine mammals, it's birds, it's everything that is part of the whole ecosystem on the East Coast. And you know, we're trying hard to keep up. In fact, I don't think we're quite caught up. We have a lot of catching up to do, but you know, it's not all doom and gloom. There's some good news, some winners and a number of losers, but you know, I think we can overcome this, and we can creatively, you know, work our way out of some of these problems that we have if we really, as others have said, all focus on it and buckle down and make some changes. It's not going to be, you know, business as usual. We're going to have to mix things up a bit and make some changes, and we can talk about those more. So, but again, I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for being here and participating, and happy to get into the question and answer session and conversation. Jay.
I hope you all feel lucky that we've got such a great panel here. I mean, I do. You know, around the world, people are taking you know, fisheries managers and fishermen are taking stock of where we're at with climate change. And I would like to hear from our panelists, from each of them, like, how do you sort of assess what's the current state of play? Where are we at now? And I'm not sure if they're going to talk about the impacts and the seriousness and the urgency of what we face, or they're going to talk maybe about, like, what is our adaptive capacity, or what are the enabling conditions for actually taking action and taking the urgent action that we need. And I think maybe I'll start with Janet, and then Bob, and then Jamie.
Thank you. Well, where we are now, we know a lot from, as Jay said, folks who are out making a living on the ocean. So in my old job as the head of the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, I really heard about the shifting stocks and the changes in the marine ecosystem, first from the fishing community, and species that were being landed. Some of our top commercially harvested species, like winter flounder, were just plummeting to the point where they had to be, the fishery had to be shut down. The lobstermen who were catching lobster for decades in Narragansett Bay no longer could make a living that way. Even those offshore in southern New England started not being able to prosecute lobster for their living and switched to what seemed to be an invasive species, Jonah crab, which is now one of the top harvested species. So I think whether you're a scientist at NOAA or a fisherman, you see the ecosystem changes very, very tangibly and dramatically, and they affect people's livelihoods. They affect some of the hardest meetings I've had in this job have been with Alaska Native communities where salmon are not coming back, and I'm sure that Representative Platola would have talked about that, to the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers where people depend on salmon for food, for their cultural significance, to pass along their traditions. And due to, so the scientists believe, due to some of the climate changing and the marine heat wave that's affecting the prey and the ecosystem. And so the salmon aren't coming back to the rivers. Obviously, if we're talking about salmon, that's true in the Central Valley of California, that's true in the Columbia River system. The drought conditions associated with climate change are really affecting the subsistence or persistence of these runs. And we have many, many critically endangered and threatened salmon stocks. So we're seeing not just the shifts, and we have a wonderful tool at NOAA Fisheries called DisMap. It's just based on our stock assessments year after year. But if you watch it and run it, you can see these shifts and expansions, and in some cases, compression. So on the West Coast, where warmer waters offshore are pushing against the cooler upwellings along the shore, you saw off the coast of California compression of the cooler water, which is forcing humpback whales following their prey into a narrower band along the coast where they were interacting with Dungeness crab vertical fishing lines, creating unprecedented levels of entanglements. And as we look at what's happening with endangered North Atlantic right whales, sometimes these ecosystem shifts are affecting coastal communities' subsistence and the fishing businesses that depend on them. But other times they're creating conflict with gear, with other ocean uses, and the multitude of climate change impacts from sea level rise. I was just at in a community in the Middle Peninsula in Virginia that's working on creating new reefs to try to protect the land from the inexorable sea level rise. Or when you look at the intense storms, we saw terrible oyster die-offs in the Gulf in Florida after a hurricane, Edward, was it? Michael. We've had so many of them, I can't remember. But similarly, we saw in terms of the salinity being inundated with fresh water, we've seen a lot of die-offs of dolphins in the Gulf. And basically, the ecosystem changes are challenging our ability to keep up with them. And so I think that's, if at this stage of the questioning, just saying that there's no place around the globe, and certainly not what I'm responsible for in the US, where we're not seeing ecosystem changes associated with climate that are happening in the same way that they have in the past. So it means that status quo management and the way we've been doing things is no longer working well. And we're going to get into what to do about it. So I'll hand it off.
Indeed. Thank you, Janet. Why don't you go ahead, Bob?
Great. Thanks, Jay. Yeah, where are we now from the East Coast perspective is, as I mentioned in my opening comments, we're in a rapidly changing environment. So you put that rapidly changing environment on top of one of the most complex management governance structures, definitely in the country and probably in the world. For those that are not real familiar with the way East Coast management's set up, there's a lot of layers to it. There's 3 councils, the only coast in the U.S. that has 3 councils: New England Council, Mid-Atlantic, South Atlantic Council. And then there's the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which has unique management authorities that obligates the states to take action once they agree to a management program. And so we're kind of in the nearshore area. The councils work in the offshore area. Then we've got the 15 individual states taking actions on certain species. And you've got NOAA Fisheries, highly migratory species, protected resources, and other things that are all, you put all these things layered on top of each other, and you've got a really fast-moving climate change issue and species redistributing and productivity changing up and down the East Coast. So you've got this, you put those two together, and we've got a problem. We got a lot of work to do. We've got to figure out how do we, the fish obviously have no respect at all for these boundaries that we've drawn in the ocean and the councils and all these other things. So we can either educate them or we can set up a way to react better as a group of managers and scientists along the coast. And that governance structure, I don't want to say it's holding us back, but it is an impediment to being very nimble and moving quickly and reacting quickly to new scientific information. And in ASMFC, some of the species that we manage, we've cut those fisheries back to just a mere shadow of what they used to be. Weak fish, southern New England winter flounder, I can go on and on. Jay referenced northern shrimp in the Gulf of Maine. That fishery's been closed since 2014. And those stocks, they're not rebounding, and it's climate change and environmental change that's affecting the changes, that's affecting what we need to do or how we're trying to rebuild these animals, and we can't do it. So we're going to keep working at the other thing along the East Coast that's emerging now is the need for greater science, and the resources to support science are diminishing or are stagnant. And when you have stagnant scientific resources, surveys are getting truncated. We're losing legs of certain surveys. We need to, biological sampling's decreased, and the difficulty is when you decrease sampling, decrease survey, decrease your information that you have to go into assessments, there's greater uncertainty. And the responsible thing to do in greater uncertainty is reduce risk, and unfortunately, a lot of times that means reduce quota. So all this uncertainty that we have on the East Coast is resulting in the managers sort of backpedaling and reducing harvest in a lot of species, and it's a difficult situation we're in right now.
Thank you, Bob. I just to quickly add, one of the things that it took me a long time to figure out and learn is that uncertainty drives over harvest risks and risks of bycatch, but it also drives conflict and lawsuits. Jamie.
So where are we now from a fisherman's perspective? I think there's no better way to hear about that than directly from a fisherman, so I'm going to cue the video.
This boat would normally have 250 pots on it. At this time, the pots are in Dutch Harbor, sitting on the beach, empty. There'd be 60 of us getting ready to go fishing. The work has stopped. When I heard about the closures, it was gut-wrenching to me. Absolutely gut-wrenching. My name's Glenn Casto. I've been fishing in the Bering Sea for roughly about 40 years. This has been my whole life. Ever since I was little, I've been on fishing boats the whole time. King crab is closed for the second year in a row. Snow crab is closed for the first time in history. This has never happened before. Being a Bering Sea crab fisherman isn't just my job, it's who I am. Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without it. It's going to be hard for not only me to find a job, but for my crew. I mean, this is what we know. It's very likely that our crew will not be back with the closures that are happening. There are a lot of factors contributing into where the crab have gone. It's not just one thing, it's multiple things. Climate change is a really big question mark. It's crab now, but what will it be in the future? We need a holistic approach on conservation and management. We need to come together as an industry to protect our crab. There is a path forward, and together we can find it.
And I want to thank the Saltonstall Kennedy Grant Program for allowing us to do that video. Our fishermen consider themselves the stewards of the resource, and as you can see in the video, they are intricately tied to crab fishing. It is part of who they are. They identify as Bering Sea crabbers and understand crab and the ocean in a deep way due to their time on the water. Alaska crab is in a climate-induced fishery crisis with devastating effects on our fishermen and the crab-dependent communities. We are a mature, rationalized fishery. 15 years we've been a catch share program, touted to create economic stability, and yet our fisheries are closed. We estimate nearly $500 million in lost revenues over the last 2 years, and many of our independent harvesters, hardworking small family businesses with second and third generation fishermen, some of them in the audience here today, are at risk of losing everything. Our fleet is experiencing two kinds of crises right now. The first is the immediate economic disaster resulting from the closure of important crab fisheries. But the second is the threat of warmer ocean conditions paired with projections of ocean acidification over the next few decades. Science shows crab populations are vulnerable to both warming and acidification, and solutions to these problems need to be underway now. The crab may adjust given time, and there are some creative solutions to be learned from aquaculture addressing ocean acidification, which we know affects shell formation. In the meantime, crab are shifting to cooler water and trending north, and fishermen are trying to figure out how to keep their businesses afloat and are asking for the management systems to adjust. And tied in all of this is some equity and environmental issues, particularly for our independent harvesters, new entrants in the fishery, and rural communities. With that, I'll turn it back to Jay.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, that was it's really, really, really sobering. And here we are. We're gonna get busy. We need goals. This is an open-ended question. You know, where do we want to be? You know, what is realistic? What does winning look like for U.S. fisheries? You want to start with that, Janet?
Oh, sure. Well, where we want it, so from a federal fisheries manager perspective, we want to continue to have the most sustainably managed fisheries in the world. We want to have all voices represented at a table when we're managing fisheries, and we want to make sure that our science is keeping up with the decisions that we need to make. So I want to talk for a minute about surveys because you know, Murphy's Law, the year 2020 that we couldn't do the crab survey because of COVID was the year we probably would have found out that the results of the previous survey, that we were moving in a direction where we needed to take management measures, but we moved in the opposite direction. So there's just fundamental surveys that are done year to year that we need to keep doing to see that trajectory over time of what's happening. But we also need to expand those because they're not necessarily measuring the right things in the right places. So one of the things we want to do is continue to expand our science using different kinds of technologies and working with the fishing community, something called cooperative research. For instance, my lobster Jonah crab example from Rhode Island, people didn't know much about the life cycle of Jonah crab, so we took fishermen who were having trouble making their living pursuing lobster and asked them to do Jonah crab research so we could understand better the life cycle of that species that they were now dependent on. So our aim is to not just understand what's going on, but be able to predict and forecast it so that managers can make decisions that will ensure sustainability. When they don't have information, the responsible thing to do is be more conservative, and then that has a ripple effect affecting fishing businesses, fishing families, and all the associated businesses. So we have something called the Climate, Ecosystems, and Fisheries Initiative that is a cross-NOAA initiative where we're working with the NOAA Research, the National Ocean Service, and our scientists to try to model what's going on. It fits in nicely with what you heard from Woods Hole this morning, so that we can better predict and forecast management decisions. You know, our biggest fishery is the pollock fishery in Alaska. We need to know, is that shifting out of US waters into Russian waters? You know, what is happening with that fishery so that people making investments and who depend on that fishery for inexpensive protein that's feeding America will make wise decisions and be able to persist in hiring and supporting the economy that depends on it. So I would say where we want to be today is making sure that we're investing in science, and I'm going to get to that later in this panel, and that we're looking at traditional knowledge and other perspectives that have been successful at managing resources during, over the centuries or millennia, and that we're taking the best information and inputting it into our management decisions. Knowing what's happening is not very useful if you're not acting on it. And I think we'll talk more about that, but we have systems that are not well set up to act very quickly. And that's been something that we're have the constraints of current law, but we have a lot of flexibility working with one another, maybe to do more and different things under the current system that we have. And again, I just wanted to restate what I said at first. The system that we had worked very well, for many, many decades, and then climate change is challenging it and shaking it at its foundation.
Thank you, Janet. It strikes me that both the
the managers, the regulators, and the regulated communities are all trying to get more nimble, because that's part of the way through this. Jamie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So where do we want to be? For us, we're thinking about what is a climate-ready fishery for a crab fishery. It's adjusting to the changes. It's resilience. In short, it's the ability to bounce back from a disruption. So for crab, ideally, we want the crab stocks to recover. We want to have our fleet protected and the fishermen keep them from going out of business. We want to better plan and buffer for any future downturns in the stock and build management systems that are more responsive. But that's the optimistic scenario, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about scenario planning here later in the panel. We also need to consider the pessimistic scenario, one where crab stocks stay at lower levels, and how do we adapt to them? Since the crab closures, Alaska Bering Sea crabbers, we've been in crisis management mode. You can search for what we've been calling the three-prong approach in the press and get a little more information on that. But basically, we've been pursuing rapid financial relief, responsive adaptive management, and continued funding for science. We've made great progress on 2 out of the 3. We've got rapid financial relief happening and continued funding for science. So a big thank you to Congress for some fishery disaster relief and to NOAA and the state of Alaska for helping make it all happen. Where we've seen the least progress is adaptive responsive management and the ability to implement conservation measures to protect crab and crab habitat, erring on the side of conservation as the crab face multiple stressors. Our management system has grown more cumbersome and rigid over the years, as you're hearing from several of us today, and it's lacking the ability to respond quickly to issues as they arise. Recently, we've built on this three-prong approach to fisheries crisis management by developing a resilient fishery action plan. It's a working draft, and you can go on our website, alaskaberingseacrabbers.org, to see more. But I really want to thank NOAA's leadership program for allowing us to have a staffer, Asia Sumilo, on detail for 4 months, and she looked across NOAA line offices across the country. She did interviews with our fishermen and stakeholders and scientists and managers and pulled together this draft action plan. It really puts it into bins on what we need managers doing, what we need scientists doing, and what we need industry doing, and then it puts it on timelines of how do we stabilize the fleet now, how do we create opportunity, and then how do we look to the future. And what we're finding in developing the Resilient Fishery Action Plan is a common theme: the need for flexibility in the regulatory system and the management, and the need for fishermen, communities, and businesses to diversify. So it's that flexibility and the diversifying, which is counter to the direction U.S. fisheries have been moving for the last several decades with limited entry programs and catch share programs, which solved pressing issues at the time around safety and bycatch and capacity. But now, how do we evolve to address the latest issues? And I want to be clear, I don't think that means getting rid of limited entry or catch share programs. They just need to evolve and bring in this concept of diversification and flexibility in some way.
Thank you. Go ahead, Bob.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll be brief on this question just so I'm not redundant, and I know we want to save some time for question and answer. So, I was going to use the word that Jay used, nimble. Along the East Coast, we need to be more nimble, be able to react quicker, be able to take in new science, absorb that, and have management changes, as a result of that. But nimbleness can't come at the expense of making decisions that aren't science-based, and it can't come at the expense of not being a transparent and open process. I think the public input and the stakeholder input in the ASMSC process and the councils and really around the country that's a key part of this, and we can't do it without that. So we've got to find a way to be as efficient as possible and collecting that information. And the final point, which is unique to the East Coast, I think, is that we need to set up a system that makes sure that the folks that are voting on final management actions fully represent the geographic range of those species. And as I mentioned, the structure that we have here on the East Coast makes that difficult at times, but not impossible. And there's a lot of creative ways to handle that. As Janet mentioned, there are some ways within the current law, so we don't have to change laws, but I think that geographic representation and taking final management actions is an important piece here on the East Coast.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. This is probably the hardest question and the one that could take us the rest of the week to really answer. But how do we get there? Is it just really great science, more nimbleness, ecosystem-based fishery management, habitat moonshot? What's it going to take? Jamie, you want to
take a first crack at that?
Sure, I'll take first crack, and I would say yes to all of those things. So the items in our Resilient Fishery Action Plan that crabbers have drafted is a starting point for how to get there, listing what managers, scientists, and fishermen can be doing in the short, medium, and longer term. But the most immediate need for us is to speed up the fishery disaster process, and I think Jay mentioned that in his opening remarks, so that businesses can weather when a crisis hits, especially small independent fishermen and communities that aren't well diversified and are vulnerable. So we need a system that gets money into fishermen's pockets and communities within 6 months, not 2 to 4 years, as the current system's taking. We need to create an emergency response checklist, much like FEMA has for when a natural disaster hits. We need something like that for fisheries. When our fishery closed and we were in a crisis mode, thankfully, the state helped us. We've got Small Business Administration bridge loans until our fishery disaster money can come together. I had to start looking for job retraining resources. But if we had the government had some sort of checklist like FEMA does, I think it would have helped tremendously as we were scrambling to respond. We need to evolve the regulatory process to extend emergency rule effectiveness beyond 1 year. We know that the council process often takes 2 or more years to get an action through, and right now our emergency rule authorities only last for up to 1 year, so that could be extended to help buffer the system. We could focus more on ecosystem-based fisheries management and less on single species management to increase efficiencies. For example, you can framework regulations to help speed up the process. I think Janet spoke to this a little bit earlier. We need agencies to partner with the industry on research. She gave an example of Jonah crab in Alaska. We had an example of that this spring. NOAA Fisheries and Alaska Department of Fish and Game got us urgent money to do crab research this spring at a time of year that the crab had never been studied, and we learned some really interesting new information. Agencies and councils could set up guiding principles to telling councils that they want to see fleets diversifying and creating flexibility in the system, and having councils think about that as they move every action through their process. Also, a whole other area that needs addressing that we haven't quite talked about yet is the source of climate change, and that requires focused action now to reduce carbon emissions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been clear that we need to reduce new emissions by 50% by 2030. If we are to be on track to prevent the worst outcomes, that means rapid development of renewable energy on a large scale, and we also need to sequester carbon already in the system and safeguard natural carbon sinks like wetlands and forests. And I want to give a shout out to some groups that are doing great work around this. Fishery Friendly Climate Action is a national group that's working with fishermen to do just this. And then Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association is doing some really novel work up in Alaska. And then Alaska Ocean Acidification Network is working across agencies and disciplines and bringing people together around this conversation. With that, I'll turn it back to Jay.
And I think I'm going to turn it on to, excuse me, I've got so many great questions here. How are we going to get there, Bob?
Thanks. Thanks, Jay. Some of the fishery management plans that we have here on the East Coast are starting to hardwire in quick reaction times rather than the American lobster fishery that has been mentioned earlier. In the Gulf of Maine, it's an unbelievably valuable fishery, one of the most valuable single species fishery along the East Coast. And how do we protect that stock or create that a resilience in that fishery if anything changes rapidly? And recently, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission implemented a rule that if the juveniles entering that population drop by 35%, there's a series that triggers met, and there's a series of management actions that the states will implement essentially immediately to react to that change. And I think those are the kind of things that we need to implement in our plans and have them available to happen quickly. And the public will know about it. The public's aware that these triggers are in there, and if this, then this. And so I think those examples are really important. And also along the East Coast, Jay mentioned it in his opening comments. We've been working through a process called scenario planning, climate change scenario planning for the past 2 years or so. It's been a long process, but it's a really great process, and the output's been wonderful. It's been about, as Jay mentioned, 300 stakeholders involved in a series of workshops up and down the coast, and it involved the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, the 3 councils that I've mentioned, NOAA Fisheries, the Northeast Science Center, Southeast Science Center, Northeast Region, Southeast Region, all the layers of the East Coast management that are here. And what the overall goal of this is sort of envisioning in this scenario 20 years out. What are the fisheries on the East Coast going to look like 20 years from now? And there's obviously a lot of different things that could happen. And they kind of came up with a matrix where on the vertical column is productivity, on the horizontal column is predictability, and you want to be in the high productivity, high predictability. You don't want to be where Jamie referenced earlier, unfortunately, in the low productivity and low predictability. And there's a series of solutions that the process has developed, and we're at the implementation stage now, where each of the 4 management bodies are going to get those recommendations and decide how to move forward on those, how to weave those into their future action plans, and how to work together. And there's a number, as I mentioned earlier, the governance structure here on the East Coast is complicated, and how do we make sure that everybody's represented fairly and equally in that process? And there's a number of outputs from the governance section of scenario planning that address that through different committee structures and other things, and different provisions within Magnuson-Stevens Act. There's the notion of in these different scenarios of the needs for better science, and it focuses a lot on what we call study fleets or cooperative science. We've got a number of cooperative surveys here along the East Coast. Some have been referenced. There's others that general surveys that are run on commercial platforms, and that data collected by those folks and those commercial platforms are some of the most trusted data here on the East Coast, because the industry, commercial and recreational industries, know the captains that run those boats. They know where this data is coming from. They know how reliable it is. They know that the guys running the boat know how to rig a net and use a net and all the other things that are important for confidence in survey work. And so as Jay mentioned, the output from scenario planning and the entire process is included on the Mid-Atlantic Council's website, and it's a great summary of what happened there. And we don't have time to really dig into all the outcomes, but they focus on 3 areas: governance, management, and science and data. And there's recommendations that can be implemented now, like short-term immediately. There's some that are kind of longer-term. There's others that are good ideas. We're just not sure exactly what we can do and how we implement those. We kind of got those in a parking lot for now, but they're going to be, they're things we're not going to let rest. We're going to keep working on those, keep working as 4 management entities as well as NOAA Fisheries, and move that process forward. And I think that's what it's going to take here on the East Coast to get to where we want to be.
Thank you, Bob. And Janet, you get the last word of this particular little section.
Okay, and I know there's so much I would like to say here, and I'll try to be succinct so that we can get to Q&A in terms of how do we get there. I think I want to talk about investment and innovation and new partnerships. Before I do, I'm glad, Jamie, that you talked about greenhouse gas mitigation, because I think and many of the speakers this morning spoke about that. The commitment by the Biden-Harris administration to combating climate change, involves aggressive actions around greenhouse gas mitigation. And that involves things like expanding offshore wind, that I want to mention just because it further complicates some of the management and survey work that we're doing, and it's something that we're thinking a lot about in fisheries management. But to investment, I'm super excited that just this week we were able to announce what NOAA is doing with the Inflation Reduction Act funding. That enables us to fund a lot of scientific work, a lot of grant programs that help put money in the communities where people know what their solutions to improving resilience or to restoring habitat are. And it allows us at NOAA Fisheries to invest in what we're calling climate-ready fisheries, but we're sort of designing it as we go. But the funding will enable us to work on expanding our science enterprise, on providing funding to the regional fisheries management councils under the Magnuson-Stevens Act that help significantly meet some of the challenges that we're talking about. So those investments will enable us to do some of what I talked about with the Climate and Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative, and I think are sorely needed, are critically needed to accelerate this, the science that we need to do. On new partnerships, I could go on and on, but I was off in San Diego Harbor last weekend with the Sport Fishing Association of California. They are working hand in glove with our Fisheries Science Center so that the fishing community can gather the research and that is needed to know what is happening with stocks and even adjust in-season management. And it's the kind of partnerships where we have the engagement of a fishing community in collecting the research in a way that directly informs management. Earlier this week, we announced a partnership with the state of Alaska around an aquaculture opportunity area. I think aquaculture is part of how we get there in terms of feeding our nation with delicious protein from the sea. And that is a partnership with the state of Alaska and NOAA looking at the right geographic areas to site aquaculture, in this case, either seaweed or shellfish, which also gives an opportunity for new jobs from the sea. Innovation, we had a meeting of the Marine Fisheries Advisory Committee last week, which is a terrific group with all sorts of perspectives. And the conclusion from that meeting was that we need to take more risks and we need to innovate. And again, we're doing it in a world where we don't expect our major statutes to change. So some of the things that Bob talked about with scenario planning and what are triggers for doing things differently or for adjusting the governance, or that Jamie talked about in terms of working with the crab industry on research that might inform new management approaches. I think we need to be getting out of our comfort zone. Everybody needs to do that, and looking at new ways of doing things, test driving them, and having feedback loops. And that's part of what we're trying to do with the modeling and the predictions. But the speed at which we need to do that, I think, calls upon us to really build trust, invest in communities, and support one another in doing things differently.
Thank you so much. I'm encouraged. I think you might have answered already the first question I picked out here, but it says, but I think you could maybe add a little bit more to the answer. So the question is, we're all excited the administration announced a $300 million climate-ready fisheries effort funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. What will be done with that $390 million? Now, I think Janet just explained that they're in the process of figuring that out, and it might be interesting to share sort of how people can track this process or get more information on how that's going.
Well, I believe later this week we're making announcements that we would make through our, our website and our regular channels of how specifically we're investing and spending that money. So I'll just kind of go over some of the buckets, which would be expanding our science enterprise, focusing on specific species like North Atlantic right whales, like Pacific salmon, like some of the reef fish in the Gulf that we see affected by climate change in ways that allow us to learn and protect other whales and other species. And a significant amount of funding is going to working with tribes, as well as some hatcheries that are important to bridge the gap as we try to restore ecosystems and allow. If we give nature a chance, often she'll bounce back. We're not as sure in some of the situations that we're confronting now, but the habitat restoration is also another area that we're significantly using IRA funds, and that's a win-win. Whether we achieve our specific goals surrounding one species or not, we know that we're improving habitats that support a multitude of species and healthier communities. So we are excited to get more into the details, and we'll announce those later and make sure that we direct you to where you can find information.
Do you all think it's going to be important to improve habitat quantity and quality in addition to doing a better job of managing fisheries? I think we're probably all on the same page. We don't get there without habitat, including water quality in places like Florida. There are a lot of questions here. There's several that relate to Alaska, so I think I'm going to turn to that. And I'm going to, this is a little unfair, but there's there's a first question that is sort of in the frame of, is it at least some good news that the author of the question is saying that ocean acidification is a huge problem with mollusks, not so much with crab. Second, maybe I'll be nice and just do them one at a time. Why don't you just a quick answer to that one would be great.
I was going to say, you're like fanning out a whole series of questions.
Yeah.
So ocean acidification is affecting crab. It hasn't been a serious influence yet that we can tell, but the waters in Alaska's Bristol Bay in particular are getting more acidic, particularly in the summer. And what we're seeing is for a longer period of time. Crab can adjust under short amounts of time for certain levels of ocean acidification, but it's when it happens more frequently and for a longer period of time, it can affect their shell formation. But I'm curious, we know there's a bottleneck with red king crab at the juvenile stage. And so we're trying to better understand ocean acidification's influence on that juvenile stage. But in talking with some of the aquaculture folks, they learned that they could raise the oyster larvae, I think they're called, or seeds, in controlled environment and then release them into the wild. So they were helping them get past that ocean acidification stage so they could build critical shell and then they release them into the wild. We're looking at exploring mariculture for king crab and where we could start raising them past a certain juvenile stage and then release them into the wild. There's been proof of concept over 10 years of research with this. It's a program called Act Crab. It's essentially king crab mariculture. But I've started thinking about, would this help get them over some bottlenecks that are happening and potential impacts of ocean acidification and get them to the next stage?
Thank you. There's the next question. I think maybe Janet might give you a little break after you take a shot at it. It's interesting, very interesting to me. The question says, there's a lot of talk about collaboration, Alaskan king crabs moving to Russia. In the current geopolitical climate, how can we collaborate on a global and national scale to conduct good science tracking fisheries and climate change research in spite of historic and political differences? And I would expand this question. The Russia situation is part of the question, but I would think about this question in terms of, how our international relations may be needing to change in terms of how this adaptive response to climate impacts. Anyone want to take a shot at that?
I don't mind starting, and then you can jump in. But I think this is a really important topic. I know some of our crab scientists have been in touch with Russian scientists, and they had some communications. Those have cooled in recent years for obvious reasons. We had an international body with Russia called BizFab, Bering Sea Fisheries Advisory Body. It recently was dissolved by the Department of State. I was a member of that body. It was dissolved by the Department of State because the treaty had waned with Russia. So I think it's an important topic. I will say communication with other countries is great, though. Our scientists are working closely with Canadian scientists on snow crab to understand how climate change is affecting snow crab in both the countries, as well as talking with Norwegian scientists, too, on king crab in particular, and king crab in Norway's waters versus Alaska's waters. So I think it's an important conversation that those, particularly the scientists with all the countries, we need to be talking about how they can better coordinate and respond quickly as changing ocean conditions are happening in their region. And also on the management side, we're trying to learn how they do management differently, adapting to changing ocean conditions in the different countries. And there are some key differences. But I think that's a topic for another panel.
Yeah, I'll add, I also agree it's a great question and topic. So I'll quickly add, we have regional fishery management organizations, and at NOAA we have a Deputy Assistant Secretary, Kelly Chris, for international fisheries. And one of the things that Kelly, working with the team at NOAA Fisheries, have been able to do is bring climate change considerations to these RFMOs so that they're specifically looking at climate impacts when they're looking to update fishery management. And that the scientific collaborations often persist despite the geopolitical rancor or conflict, so that the scientists at NOAA Fisheries and across NOAA are continuing to work with colleagues around the world in ways that are even more important as you see these shifting stocks and realize that we're all in this together.
Thank you so much. Well, I think if we really want to do this, we can't avoid all the hard questions, right? There's several questions about offshore wind. I'll just I guess for many years I was asking the question of how much biodiversity harm should we accept in order to keep cooking down the whole planet, if I can be that glib. And for me, the answers tended to be every year a little bit more maybe. And yet there's some really serious, as was mentioned in one of the sessions this morning, no form of energy production is benign, and there's a potential for really significant disruption to existing ocean uses, namely fisheries. And so the questions, in that general vein, what are the primary concerns related to offshore wind development and fisheries impacts? How are we managing for that? And then as a regulator, how do you recommend balancing the rapid development of offshore wind and the impacts of climate change on fisheries? And I'm sorry, Janet, but you're probably the best.
I will take it, Bob. If you want to comment first, you're welcome to.
Go ahead.
Okay. So at NOAA Fisheries, we have responsibility under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, of playing a regulatory role over offshore wind, which is led by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management out of the Interior Department. And the expansion of offshore wind is quite obviously of great concern and having an impact on, or will have an impact on, fisheries in multiple ways. So what we're doing at NOAA Fisheries is a lot. It's a big focus, and we've been expanding our capacity. But we're working within the laws that we have closely with BOEM and with the states to try to do the best job possible at citing, avoiding, minimizing, mitigating impacts. It's definitely an experiment, I guess would be the word, because we're rapidly, we have ambitions to rapidly expand offshore wind, and at the moment there's 7 turbines in the water, 5 off the coast of Rhode Island in state waters. And so there are many other places in the world where they have data and experience with offshore wind. Our aim is to have fishing happen coincident with these wind farms, and that's the goal. But again, in terms of whether the spacing and the reality will work for all gear types is something that is unknown. So we are working to increase some funding for marine spatial planning, gathering data up front to facilitate siting of offshore wind in places that have fewer conflicts, something that was done, I think, quite successfully in the Gulf of Mexico. We're improving our collaboration with BOEM around proactively looking at mitigating impacts to surveys, mitigating impacts to marine mammals. And the fishing community is, rightfully looking to engage more effectively so that the outcomes of the siting and the development of offshore wind mean that they would get mitigated or compensated for adverse impacts should they either be shut out of an area or the fishing change. So BOEM has a draft policy on fishing compensation, and the states have some authority there. It is a very difficult set of issues, and the development of multiple wind farms, starting with our Atlantic coast, in areas that are heavily used by the fishing community and are on migratory pathways for marine mammals, is something that we're trying to do as durably, responsibly, sustainably as possible, and learning as we go. I think we have new challenges with floating offshore wind that are different from the monopile farms that have already been approved on the East Coast, and a lot of work with Department of Energy as well as others around the research and development of both the technologies and the approach to the mitigation measures. I'll just stop by saying it has been a big challenge, I think, for NOAA Fisheries to scale up, get the best science, and work to review and perform our role. And I'm really proud of the work we've done around offshore wind.
Thank you, Janet. And I know this is a topic that comes up at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Bob's been at the center of some of those conversations. Is it all happiness in that space for you?
Well, I need to be careful what I say because ultimately I work for 15 states, which means I indirectly work for 15 governors with 15 different opinions on wind energy. So I walk a fine line. But it's not. You know, there's a lot going on. The states are putting an amazing amount of resources into trying to keep up and you know, evaluate the impacts of what would happen to habitats and fisheries. The recreational community in a lot of areas is actually looking forward to this. It's structure. It's kind of like the oil rigs down in the Gulf of Mexico. So they're seeing this as a positive thing. The commercial fisheries, not so much. As Janet mentioned, they may be locked out of these areas. One of the big impacts that the states are wrestling with now is the impact of surveys. I think there's over 1 million acres in lease right now along the East Coast, and a lot of the fishery independent surveys that have been going on for decades, those areas will no longer be able to be sampled. So you've got a long time series of data and a footprint of a survey that overlaps a footprint, or in it, you know, sort of this Venn diagram, parts of it are going to overlap with the survey and the wind farm footprint. How do we calibrate all those different surveys, and how do we figure out if species are moving differently? Is that climate change, or is that impact from wind farms? How do you pick all these different competing signals apart? And that's going to be one of the challenges that the states are dealing with. And then the states are also dealing with small scale issues of transmission lines. They're coming back to shore to plug into the grid somewhere. And some of the initial plans had the transmission lines coming back through really sensitive habitat areas, and you know, the straightest line possible is the best for the power company and the developers, but it's not best for the habitat all the time. So we've been working with that to try to mitigate the impacts of transmission lines back to shore. But it's an amazing change that's happening along the East Coast, and the states are again struggling to keep up.
Could I add just one thing on that? Having worked for 3 governors, albeit all in the same state, I just want to reiterate, and I think Dr. Lubchenco said this morning, just we don't really have a choice if we're talking about all the ecosystem changes that we're seeing due to climate change. So if we don't aggressively decarbonize our energy supply, we're consigning ourselves to a pretty grim future. So I think the governors I worked for, obviously this administration, sees the scale up of offshore wind as ultimately something that is critical to slowing the pace of climate change and ensuring we continue to have ecosystems that can be resilient and productive. So this is difficult stuff.
Mm-hmm. I have to apologize in advance because all of these questions are so good and we're not going to get through them all. There's several that relate to, that are similar to this one. How will the agency and industry respect the spaces of Alaskan native use of the ocean as species move north? Local fishermen should be protected. Our subsistence hunters should be able to continue without industry disturbance of marine mammals. And Jamie might have some thoughts on this, and I just maybe expand the question slightly, because through the scenario planning process and other conversations, as species move and we start to have to rethink allocations, I think it's a good opportunity to start rethinking about who are our stakeholders and are there some that are underrepresented in those conversations. But Jamie?
Yeah, I think it's a really tough question, and I cannot pretend to represent a native perspective. They need to speak for themselves. But I know for crab, we do know stocks are moving, and it's going to affect who has access to them. You know, our fishermen can move, but some of the folks in native rural communities, I think of St. Paul, it's a very remote community out in the Pribilof Islands in the middle of the Bering Sea. So some places, they're very place-based and they can't move as stocks are moving. So, but I think it all comes back to we need to all be talking together and having the hard conversations.
Thank you.
I just want to mention that my first trip to Alaska, when I was meeting with Alaska Native community, and they were talking about these issues, they suggested that NOAA Fisheries take a look at our national standards. They're created under the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and the managers are compelled to abide by them. But many of them, in terms of the guidance and the guidelines that we provide, had not been updated for 10, 15, 25 years. And so they asked if I would take a look at those And we are right now in the midst of what's called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, a mouthful, asking for input on updating our national standards associated with allocation of fisheries resources, associated with coastal communities and supporting them, and associated with bycatch. And that is an effort that aligns with an equity and environmental justice strategy that we've been working on and released to try to look at, re-examine some of the guidance and the basis for decision-making that was not perhaps thinking at all about a world in which climate change was rapidly affecting ecosystems, or that we don't have representational equity in a lot of these decision-making bodies and some of the issues that were mentioned in that question. So I commend that to people because we're looking for input on that. And it's a way of working within existing laws and systems to update some of our thinking or directions.
Wonderful. We have to pivot now to closing remarks. There are so many smart questions here, but our time is drawing near to an end, and I encourage all of you to look for the panelists and the organizations they represent to follow up on some of these questions, because they're great ones. Why don't we conclude now with some closing thoughts, a minute each. You know, I don't have any notes on what order we're going to go on. You want to go, Bob, Jamie,
Sure.
Janet? All right.
Sure, I'll go first. Yeah, well, again, thank you. It's been a great conversation. I just want to end on the positive. It's not all doom and gloom. You know, there's a number of species here on the East Coast that their range is expanding, not just shifting. So, you know, and it appears the productivity of those stocks is going up. Black sea bass, as Jay mentioned early on, Spanish mackerel, blue crabs, you know, the white shrimp fishery that's emerging off of Virginia and Maryland now, and other species. And you know, there's some good news in this. Atlantic croakers and other species. But the management process needs to respond to the good news as quickly as it does to the bad news. You know, if there are new fisheries and they're moving into new areas, we need to make sure those fisheries have controlled growth and make sure that, you know, they don't, if sort of this leading edge of a stock expansion isn't just sort of lopped off by quick commercial and recreational fisheries, and we lose all that productivity. So, you know, I think that's something we need to keep an eye on. And you know, the other good news is there's a lot of you guys are in this room is dedicated, smart, creative people that are finding good solutions and ways out of this mess. And I think we're in good shape. But the point that has been made by, I think, everyone up here and is worth, in my mind, reiterating is we can't go ahead with business as usual and just sit here and not be willing to change. The management process as it's wired now and the scientific process as it's wired now won't get us there. We need to make some changes. We need to be more adaptable and need to be able to move quickly. And we may have to do that in a climate of reduced resources, which is really difficult. You know, the financial support for fisheries and surveys may be going down over time or maybe stagnant over time, which is the equivalent of going down given the expense of doing surveys and other things. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of good folks working on this. We'll make it through this. We'll keep working on it. But we've got to be willing to make some tough decisions and get out of our comfort zone and not just go with business as usual.
Hear, hear.
And I'll add to that. Those were great comments. And yeah, I will add status quo is not working. We've got to act now using the science available even in the face of incomplete information and uncertainty. We have to have hard conversations and start making changes to the way we're doing business. With what some Bering Sea crab stocks are facing, I hear all too often from scientists, managers, and decision makers that say it's climate change, we can't do anything about it. And that's really discouraging, and I think it's simply irresponsible, not only for crab, but for the planet and for future generations. Borrowing a phrase from Loretta Ross, let's all call each other in. Calling in to take responsibility for what each of us can do here in the room. We can all do better, and not later, after we collect more data, but now. How can we start acting now? Each and every one of us has the power to make positive change and keep U.S. fisheries sustainable, keep cultures and fishing communities vibrant, protect small family businesses like Glenn in the video you saw from earlier, keep fishermen fishing and bringing healthy protein that has a low carbon footprint to the people on our planet.
Nice. Janet?
Beautiful. And The President's America the Beautiful initiative really endorses listening to communities and community-based solutions. And I know for myself, as the head of NOAA Fisheries, Dr. Spinrad as the head of NOAA, Secretary Raimondo, up to President Biden throughout the administration, our feeling is that we need to do this in a collaborative way, this hard work that we have in front of us. So it's an awesome responsibility that I feel every day, but it's a responsibility that I share with all of you. And I think what both of you said was beautiful, and would just say that on a personal level, in being able to see the restoration of fish ponds in Hawaii, see a native Atlantic salmon in our main river. I encourage everyone to find those things that inspire you in nature, as well as supporting one another, because I think what brings me hope is knowing that we're in this together, working to tackle these hard problems. And the ecosystem-based fisheries management involves working with the people in the communities and building the resilience. And I'm heartened by people like my colleagues on this panel and at events like this. So thank you.
Thank you all. And I just want to, I'm not really supposed to get closing remarks, but I do want to end with how I should have started, with some deep thanks to all of you for your attention to this topic here and online, to my colleagues, my panelists, friends, and especially to the National Marine Stewardship Foundation for hosting this amazing event for so many years. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Never mind.
Thank you all. This is an amazing conversation. I deeply appreciate the depth and the amount that you covered, and at the same time knowing there's so much more that we wanted to say. But I think it was critical to be able to address how do we look at this in the realm of food insecurity, in the realm of our communities holistically, and thinking about inclusion and really listening, learning, and thinking about that not only from our stock assessments and improving some of the science we have ongoing, but also thinking more holistically about Indigenous knowledge and other ways of knowing. All of these pieces are critical as we think about what are the actions we take and the timelines that we need to be able to do that on, to act now. So thank you very much for ending on those pieces of hope as well, because we need to be able to move things forward with everyone in this room virtually. This is something we cannot fail at. Food insecurity is something we cannot fail at. So we're going to take a short break, and I welcome you all back at 3 o'clock for our final session of the day from the front lines of climate change, where we'll look at and feature some of the different communities across the country facing some of the greatest burdens of climate. Thank you.